The beauty of the NFL draft is that some people can see the same players totally differently. And one of those players in this class, which is currently splitting opinions, is Mykel Williams, the edge rusher from Georgia. And I'm joined by Theo Ash, 1/3 of the Stay Hot podcast and one of the biggest NFL analysts on any social media platform. And he's here to convince me that Mykel Williams is better than I think he is. So, Theo, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. You said that Mykel Williams should be in everyone's top 5. Why?
Man, I just think that he does so many things that blow my mind outside of maybe your traditional outside the arc pass rushing. When I turned on the film with him, it was super refreshing how polished he was and some of the things that he was doing within that Georgia front, the dirty work that he was doing in that Georgia front that he was doing at a very high level. First of all, just defending the run. After watching some of the edges in this class, like some guys are better than others. Like Shamar Stewart is a fantastic run defender. You know, Mike Green, that's just not quite his game, maybe. But then I turned on Mykel Williams and was watching the Notre Dame game, and there was a play that he had early in that one where he took the tight end, locked him out. The tight end ran into the pulling guard who was trying to kick out the end man on the line of scrimmage, and then the lead blocker was coming through trying to, lead the running back there. Mykel Williams threw the tight end out of the way, took on that other lead blocker, and really took out 3 guys over the course of the play. And it kept his linebacker free to make a good tackle. And when I watch, Mykel Williams highlights, because I like doing that as well to get a feel for the player, like that
The
play
Kurt Beninckert special.
Yeah, I know. That play is just nowhere to be found, and it's such a great play. It took 3 guys out, and I just think that some of the things that he does over the course of the game just don't get recognized in some of the highlight packages, and I think he gets underrated because of it. But man, when he does some of the dirty work in that Georgia front, he does it at such a high level, and I think he's just a super valuable piece for them. And really, any NFL team, I think, would love to have his skill set.
It's so interesting because if you look at the stats from the Notre Dame game, where he had technically 0 pressures, at least per PFF, 0 pressures, and I know to a degree those stats are always a little bit murky. It's what counts as a pressure for you, what doesn't, etc. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that you cited that game, which is the one where, technically speaking, at least from the stats that I can gather, he had no measurable quote unquote impact. But that's why obviously tape is so important when you're watching. It's not just about is it a sack, is it a pressure? It's about the wider kind of impact you have on the game. But obviously the Texas game was the one where I think his impact did translate to stats. And you posted a cut up of the Texas game. I went back and watched it ahead of this, and that was undeniably his best game, right? But there was no Kelvin Banks. So Mykel Williams was going against the backup and was going against Cameron Williams, who got absolutely worked by Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, also in the playoffs. Do you, when you're watching a player like Mykel Williams, does that ever come into your mind? Are you ever questioning kind of competition level, or is it just purely you're up against the man you're up against, and can you dominate?
It's both, I think. I mean, you want to be at your best against the best, certainly. And if you're not going up against the best, you better be, whooping ass the whole time, really. If you're not, then that's concerning. He did what he was supposed to do in that second Texas game, in the SEC championship game. And then going back and watching the first Texas game, he was going up against Banks, and he beat him around the outside shoulder twice, and he forced a fumble on Quinn Ewers versus Banks, and he had another big hit on Ewers in that game. So to me, he kind of showed both things versus Texas. He showed that he can beat the best player on the Texas offense, or who knows, I guess that might be a bit of a broad thing to say, but one of the best players, a highly touted draft prospect, he was able to beat him. And then when the backup was in, he was able to just consistently get after the quarterback, and he had 2 pressures in that Texas game that resulted in picks. He had a sack. I think he may have had 2 sacks in that second Texas game. And he tipped a pass. He fit the run really well. So, man, that SEC championship game, I was like, okay, this guy's not necessarily bending it around the edge. And I do see what people are saying about the stiffness. But, there's guys in the league like DeMarcus Lawrence for the Cowboys years ago, Jadeveon Clowney, who was the first overall pick, never quite lived up to that, but I think has been a very valuable player for a long time. Just recently for the Ravens, he was their best pass rusher on a dominant defense, right? So I don't think it was like a bad pick, just maybe not the number one pick where Williams isn't really being discussed. So I think despite maybe some of his shortcomings, as a 20-year-old edge rushing prospect, he still does a lot of really valuable things in the run game and on stunts. And I think as a pass rusher, he's got some good high-end moments that make me think like, look, at 20 years old, this can be developed further.
And you mentioned how young he is, right? You posted as well, 20 years old until June, and you get all those kind of memes, right? You know, he's older than Tremaine Edmonds, and you know he played with Matthew Stafford at Georgia. You know, age is always a factor when evaluating these prospects, and I think to a degree, rightly so. But how important do you think that age is now in an era where we have the NIL and we have the transfer portal, and college players are going to stay in college for longer, generally speaking, not always, obviously. But do you think that age is an important factor, or is it down to position, or?
I think it depends. I mean, we just saw Jaden Daniels have a historically good rookie season as an older rookie. So it's not the end all be all, but when you look at older quarterbacks who get drafted, it's not a high success rate. You know, Daniels and Bo Nix were kind of exceptions really this year. It's not an inspiring list really outside of those guys. So especially going into the last draft class, I was like, that's a big deal, you know? If someone walks into college football and just figures it out when they're 18 years old, 19 years old, I do think that means more to me if you walk in and you figure it out when you're 23 and you're physically more developed than some of these freshmen around you, right? So I do think it matters a little bit, but obviously it's not the golden bullet or anything like that. But it does impress me that Williams was able to walk into Georgia, the best program in the country, and lead that team in sacks as a freshman. That does mean something to me. That's a huge accomplishment that other guys in this class just don't have, you know. So that it's another point in his favor that he's so young and can be developed. You would think, perhaps more than some of the other guys who are older.
And you mentioned the sack total. Obviously, Mykel doesn't have the most gaudy stats in terms of production, 26 total pressures in 23 and 24, 5 sacks and 6 sacks respectively. We've seen a lot of these like uber athletic, very toolsy defensive linemen, you know, like something like Vic Beasley for the Falcons, who had that 16 sack season and then just went missing, really. Trayvon Walker's beginning to put it together. Tyree Wilson's just about showing something. Do you see Mykel being able to kind of break that mold of an edge or a defensive lineman rather that doesn't quite have the production but has the athletic and physical profile, and kind of break that mold of not really being able to hit the ground running year one?
Yeah, I think he's got it, just because I think the Georgia pass rush doesn't really lend itself well to getting a bunch of sacks. Like in his entire career, and Jalen Carter only had 6 sacks at Georgia. Nolan Smith had 11 and a half in 4 years. Trayvon Walker hardly had any production, and he was the first overall pick in the draft over Aiden Hutchinson, who had a bunch, which just goes to show how much teams can value, and maybe mistakenly so in this case, but teams can really value a piece that can move inside and out, really set a strong edge against the run, and just be a freakish body type, which Mykel Williams has some of that. So it is at Georgia. I think he can break the mold of not being super productive and upping that at the NFL level, just because the Georgia pass rush is just about how all the pieces fit together. You know, someone is stunting inside, he's trying to take up 2 bodies, and then like number 11 on their team is trying to loop around and get into that gap that they just opened up. So it's not necessarily a true like one-on-one pass rush situation over and over again. It's how can we target where the quarterback releases the ball from, force him to step up and then have someone there. And then if he slides, like have somebody there at all. It's like a route concept, really. Like it's not always let's pin our ears back and get a sack at Georgia. It's how can all these pieces fit together? And I think Williams is usually getting to the right spot in the overall context of the pass rush plan, which, might be his role at the NFL level. And it might not be a ton of sacks, I will say. Compared to someone like Abdul Carter, certainly, who, you watch him, he's just bending the arc over and over again, right? He's just going outside the outside shoulder, and that is a good way to get sacks, definitely. But Just because Williams doesn't have that type of play style doesn't mean he can't be incredibly valuable. And I think the Georgia defense having all the success that it has without any individual player putting up those numbers just kind of goes to show that.
I think that's a really interesting point from you talking about Georgia and how like they're not expecting their guys just to pin their ears back and every man for himself kind of getting off the pass. I mean, we see that in the NFL as well with like Daniil Hunter being brought in by the Texans because they that's what they wanted. They wanted someone that would play to their system. But then how would you use Mykel Williams at the next level? Because obviously he gets moved around the defensive line a lot at Georgia. I mean, in that Texas game, he was in a 2-point stance, a 3-point stance. He was a wide 9 where he got that pressure with the arm over on the offensive tackle. Even moved as a 2I at one point in the final 2 minutes of the game, like right kind of almost in between the center and the guard. So how would you want him to keep that versatility and kind of move him around? Or would you see him more as like a 4-3 hand in the dirt defensive end or a 3-4 outside linebacker? Or
I think it's nice that he has that versatility to work across the defensive line, any alignment. I saw him align at nose at Georgia. You know, he was aligned inside the tackle, maybe even more often than not. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I definitely think he should be outside a little bit more. I think that his skill set would look more normal and people would be higher on him if he just got to focus on rushing off the edge over and over again. I do think in the NFL, like these guards and these centers are probably just too good for someone that light to line up inside as often as he does. So I do think he should move a bit to the outside. I think about like watching Will Anderson his senior year at Alabama. Or his junior year, he didn't play his senior year. His last year at Alabama, he was in that 3 tech or 4-eye tech almost all the time. Now you don't see him aligned there so often. You want him out on the edge more. So I think that Mykel Williams, you're probably going to pigeonhole him as an edge a lot more at the NFL level, but in certain situations, certainly you'll want to kick him inside and work certain matchups. Maybe a little bit like Zadarius Smith. He's somebody that the Packers, my team, used to have, and he's played on a variety of teams. He's someone that primarily lines up on the edge, but if they think he can work a center, he'll line up over the center, and he can hold up there versus the run because he has such long arms, and he's a smart player. So I think you'll want him to remain a versatile piece, but you'll probably want him to stay at edge more often, as an end in a 4-3.
Interesting. And you mentioned also Abdul Carter, and obviously he's someone that has a bit of position. Well, I say a bit, has positional versatility, obviously coming from linebacker, moving to edge. And you also posted a cut of the Maryland game, which for anyone watching, if you want to watch any Abdul Carter tape, it is that game. Yeah. I think that in that game, that is, and obviously he's going to get a lot of comparisons to Micah Parsons. Whereas number 11 converted from off-ball linebacker to edge, plays at Penn State, right? Like it's helmet-wise and kind of profile-wise, it's all there. In that one game, though, that was the closest I think he actually looks to Micah Parsons, getting pressures like up the A gap, kind of moving around off the edge. Like it was seriously dominant. Do you think that Parsons comparison to Carter is too rich, or do you think it's actually quite accurate?
It's a little rich. I get so concerned all the time when people comp to all pros and things like that. Like he might be Micah Parsons, but just still, when you compare anybody to a guy like that or Garrett or Bosa or Watt, it just is like, man, that's so lofty. But I see where they're coming from, man. He's got such an electric first step. In that Maryland game, you saw his counters, his ability to, set up around the outside arc and spin inside or just give a little twitchy head fake, and that's enough to freeze the guy in front of him. And yeah, rushing up the A gap, like his closing speed is electric. His agility is electric. His first step is electric. His bend is electric. Like all that is in common with Micah Parsons. I will say about Parsons, he's a little bit more compact. I think he's a little bit like sturdier and beefier. And Carter is more of this lanky, longer skinnier type of guy. So from a body type perspective, I think they're different. And I think that might lend itself to surviving a little bit more kicked insides, maybe surviving against the run a little bit for Parsons, bull rushing for Parsons. So they're not the exact same player, certainly. But It's hard not to see the comps in terms of how their careers have gone. They follow the same beats pretty much step by step, except Parsons was always off the ball at Penn State and didn't move to edge until after his rookie year in the NFL.
And obviously, it's still quite early in the evaluation process. I'm not sure where you're at with the quarterbacks, but is Abdul Carter a player that you would consider taking first overall for the Titans, or if say a team traded up?
I think so. I think a really good edge rusher is more valuable to a team than just a decent quarterback. And I think that that is the case in this draft, that you got two decent quarterback prospects, and Abdul Carter is really a high-end pass rusher who could have double-digit sacks his rookie season and come up big for you in huge moments, late in games and on third downs. And he can get your guys off the field and put the ball in the quarterback's hands. And I think the positional value aspect of everything is something I'm really rethinking after the past few draft class. I was one of the people who really panned the Lions for taking a linebacker and a running back so early. It's like, oh, what do you, that's not
Same.
how you build it out, right? Like, you build it out a different way. You need to take an edge in the first round, not a running back. And then that edge is, or not, that running back is Jahmyr Gibbs, and he's a superstar and incredibly valuable behind that offensive line. So ever since that happened, I'm like, man, just get the good players. And if it's edge first and then quarterback next year, that's fine. That's a good way to do it, I think. As long as you have the most blue chip talent on your team as possible, you'll be in a good position. Look at the Eagles. They picked a quarterback in the second round, and they paid money to a running back, and an off-ball linebacker is the centerpiece of their team, and they just won the Super Bowl because they just, they built up the trenches and had a bunch of good players there. So if you're the Titans, I definitely think, yeah, let's just take the best player available. And if you think that's Carter, I'm totally down to take Carter and wait a year for your quarterback, or bring in Rodgers to be a stopgap or something like that. You'll probably be in a position to draft a guy next year. Like, I don't think Abdul Carter is going to prevent you from ever getting that quarterback. So I am down to take him first overall, really.
I would agree. I think, having looked at the quarterback class, and I'm sure when you come round to it, it's the kind of the classic, like, yeah, they're good. Like, I like Cam Ward, but I think if I'm looking at Abdul Carter or Cam Ward, or potentially, an even better quarterback next year, I'd lean towards Abdul Carter. But I think, am I right in saying that you're also a James Pearce Jr.? Are you a James Pearce Jr. believer, or are you a James Pearce Jr. doubter?
I don't know. I'm somewhere in between. What are you?
I'm a big believer. I'm all in. Like, I agree with what I've seen from you as well. Like, I think that he doesn't quite have like the refinement almost. Like, he's kind of already really good despite not actually being that good, if that makes sense. If I can put it in like the dumbest way possible, like to really dumb it down. I just think his first step is so elite. I think he's so quick off the edge. I think he's actually quite good against the run, despite the size
Definitely.
questions. Like, obviously, Mykel Williams is amazing at locking those arms out, but James Pearce Jr. was able to do it to Tyler Booker, who's got like 80 pounds on him in that Alabama game. So I'm a big James Pearce Jr. believer, but I want to know what you think.
Yeah, he's weird because he's 243 pounds when I Google it. And he just has the type of game that I wouldn't expect from somebody that light. Like, he really is stiff to me. Like, he doesn't have the ability to really disconnect his upper and lower half like some other guys have, and the ankle flexion isn't really there for me. Like, he's a very linear, kind of straight line type of guy. But against the Bama game, what does that turn into? That turns into some really successful bull rushes, because he's got that first step and he gets his hands in the right place, and he can like kind of wiggle around the chip help and then convert that body position into power on the tackle. Like, he's really good at doing those things and walking guys back, and he's good at defending the run, and he's smart. He's disciplined. He diagnoses plays quickly. He is clutch. Like, against Florida, I saw him force a fumble on a QB sneak and recover it. So instead of 6 points for the offense, like, the defense gets the ball back for their team. And against Ohio State, I saw them try to sneak it, and they turned it into a pass, and he was all over it. Like, he just popped out and started getting out to the sideline. So he tackled that on a fourth down. So he's cerebral. Like, he gets his hands in the right place. Like, he's got that first step. He'll jump the snap too. He's a strange player, because a light player with such a high win rate, you really expect to see elite bend, and you expect to see him, like Mike Green, like hitting these spin moves and playing under a table. It's just not his game, and it's strange to watch, and it's strange to project. Like, is this going to work? A 240-pound kind of power rusher, but he's hard to push around. He can push the pocket. He's smart. I don't love him, but I do think that he can make that skill set work in the NFL. He's someone I've got kind of a later first round grade on. Honestly, his skill set kind of reminds me of Williams a little bit. He's just way lighter. You wouldn't expect it. You wouldn't expect it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I also think with James Pearce Jr., there's a slight aspect of almost like prospect fatigue. Like you were talking about, like kind of the running back scenario with the Eagles. I think that's almost kind of true with James Pearce Jr. Like the pendulum swung too far the other way, because this time last year it was, this guy's going to be the first overall pick, and obviously a 240-pound edge rusher is not going to go first overall.
Yeah.
But as a result, I feel like people have kind of been like, okay, well, he's not worthy of the first overall pick, which I don't think he is. Obviously, he's not Abdul Carter. But I think as a result, people have kind of forgotten about him and kind of put him on the back burners, when really, like, I actually think he's almost a very underrated prospect at this point. But you also mentioned Mike Green from Marshall. How worried, not worried, how would you evaluate him with coming from a team like Marshall?
Yeah, you got to dominate. You got to dominate if you're coming from a place like Marshall. There can be no like, well, it's okay, it's pretty good. Like Trey Lance at North Dakota State, like looking back on it, he probably should have dominated more, like it should have been every single game. He's going crazy if they're going to trade up for him and give up all those resources to take a guy like that high. Like, you should really just be at the top of the league in everything. And that's what Mike Green is. He's at the top of college football in sacks. I think PFF had him at the top of college football in run stops too. So he did what he needed to do to be a first round pick at Marshall. And I really like the pass rushing tape. He understands how to set people up with head fake. He reminds me of Abdul Carter, honestly. Like he's got a very similar game. He can bend under a table at full speed. He can set guys up. His spin move versus Ohio State is one of the best individual pass rush reps I've ever seen in my life, right? So I have full faith in him to step in and be able to rush NFL tackles, because the tape is just so good and he was so productive. I guess my question would just be, how good is he against the run at the NFL level? Because I feel like Ohio State was able to get on him a little bit, even with their tight ends, and they were able to push him around. I think that was a very fair fight in the running game, was Mike Green versus the Ohio State tight ends, which you would like him to be dominant against skill position players. And against tackles, like versus Virginia Tech, I just think when he was asked to set the edge and things like that, he just doesn't get into that nice, powerful lockout position that you see from some of these other edge rushers. So how much can you have him on the field on first and second down, even though I trust him to be a dominant player on third? It would be my question.
And is there, because obviously before maybe the Senior Bowl, or before maybe people kind of got into the weeds a bit, someone like Mike Green might have been a bit of a quote-unquote sleeper, right? Coming from Marshall, they're not known for their first-round edge rushers. Is there anyone that you've looked at so far, either edge or otherwise, but specifically edge, I guess, because that's what I know you've looked at, that people aren't talking enough about that should go in the first round?
I kind of like JTT's game out of Ohio State. I like him more than Sawyer, and I feel like Sawyer gets more hype. I think Tuamoloau, I think is how you pronounce his last name. I'm not sure on that. He's got a game where he's got a little bit of bend, I think more than Sawyer. And he's very cerebral. He's very smart in coverage. He can drop back and still be kind of a positive player for you. Against the run, he gets width and can set the edge versus the wide zone like you'd like. And he's technical too. Like he knows how to get hands off of him. It's hard to engage with him for very long. I just wish he had a bit more juice and played with a bit more, oomph, like bull rushing, things like that. But I think when you watch his film, there's a lot of impressive things that he does. And I think he's someone who could be talked about a bit more. I mean, he had like 16 sacks this season or something like that. So he was very productive despite the lack of an electric first step and maybe the lack of extreme pop in his hands. He's someone that plays, obviously championship football and has a good little bundle of tools going for him. He's not the deepest sleeper ever. I'm just not there yet. And some of the guys that I've watched, I'm just like later in the draft, like the Josiah Stewarts of the world from Michigan. I'm like, I don't know if they're first round picks or anything like that. I haven't watched someone I'm necessarily in love with yet. I might
I mean,
name Ivy from Ole Miss too, is someone that I've watched on broadcast though, and I've liked. So we'll see.
well, I mean that's the beauty of the draft, isn't it? Getting into the players. I mean, I'm a big Jack Sawyer guy. I must admit, I do like. I think he's very much what you see is what you get, right? Like he'll be a good edge too. You're not going to really draft him with the hopes he's going to magically become a dominant edge rusher, but I just think I think he's so rock solid. I like both of them, honestly. I think it's a great shout from you. And is there then a prospect that you just don't see it? First round pick, you're like, these guys are crazy. I often say that it's like the Emperor's New Clothes. You know, someone's standing up there naked and everyone's going, oh my God, look how amazing his new suit is. And they're just like, no, this guy's just naked. Like, what are we all doing here?
There's no one I think is too bad that I've seen so far.
Because I think Jalen Walker, I can't wrap my head around Jalen Walker. You mentioned him actually, number 11 for Georgia, the linebacker. He's just someone that I'm like, he's a jack of all trades, master of none. Yeah, he's a good blitzer, but not a great pass rusher. He's not great in coverage. And I know that Daniel Jeremiah had him at 6 and Dane Brugler had him at 3. And I was like, what? Like, what? I've got to be missing something here. Is there anyone just even at this early stage? It obviously might change. All of these are subject to change.
Definitely the quarterback class a little bit is how I feel that about. None of the edges I've seen so far seem like fraudulent, I think. But when I see guys like Cam Ward get hyped as like the first overall pick in the draft, I do think that's a bit of almost a disservice to them. It's like with Ward, he's got great balance, creativity, big time arm. But there's just a lot of kinks that I think need to be ironed out. The low release point. He throws it so sidearm. I'm worried about things getting batted. I don't think he throws with great touch all the time. Like he's got an arm, right? But is the ball just getting dropped nicely in a catchable spot all the time? Like, no, he misses some throws that I'd like to see hit. So that's definitely the first name that comes to mind is the presumptive first overall pick in the draft. I'm watching him like, yeah, he's good, but just because he's a quarterback, it doesn't mean that he has to go quite that high. So I don't want to say like he's naked. He's got some clothes on, but it's not quite as surefire, I think, as some are making it out to be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Cam Ward is my QB1, but it's kind of like not quite in the sense that Kenny Pickett was QB1, right? But it is obviously relative to the strength of the draft class. Like I think Cam Ward would have comfortably been QB4 last year. Now, obviously, we saw in the end 6 of them go in like the top 12 picks. Yeah. So obviously, it's a quarterback-driven league. Teams like the Falcons have taken obviously Michael Penix, and they're probably quite glad about that now. Even though I massively panned that pick because it just made no sense to me at the time. But then if you were the GM, how much of a team, of any team, doesn't really matter, how much importance would you place on positional value? Because obviously that's the debate. You mentioned the Lions drafting an on-off-ball linebacker and a running back. What's the sweet spot there for you in terms of positional value and talent?
I think like Ty goes to the quarterback edge. I think there's something to be said for building things out from inside out. So trench players before skill position players, it does make sense to me. I think a running back added to a situation where there is no blocking, that probably isn't going to be a great idea. So you want to build that line out first, and then the running back as the final piece can kind of ignite the whole offense and really make things unstoppable. But that you can't draft an entire offensive line in one pick. One left guard isn't necessarily making your entire operation smooth either. So it's something I struggle with. It's something that I would try not to fall into too much, just because it's burned me. It seems like if you can get a guy at a discount because he plays a certain position, but he's more talented than the players who went ahead of him, that seems like the Moneyball thing to be doing, instead of trying to measure like, oh, what is an offensive lineman's value and over the course of an entire team. There's just not a lot of metrics to measure those kinds of things at this point. They're not getting stats. So I just think you should trust your board, you should trust your grades, and if for the most part, if you should take take anybody, it should be the highest graded player. But I definitely see the vision in taking kind of those trench players first and getting solid there before. If it's a tie, I would try to do that. But if there's a special running back and all the guards and tackles were just okay, I'd take the running back.
Well, I mean, I still to this day, 2 years ago when it was the Lions draft, when it was Jameer Gibbs, and their linebacker Jack Campbell, I gave that draft an F, and I still get Lions. Yeah. And I still get Lions fans commenting on the video going, "How's this age? This age like milk?" And I'm just like, "Oh, guys, please. Like this is a long time ago now. Like, yes, I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but I was a big positional value guy, and I still kind of am. But it's kind of on a case-by-case basis, right? Like it's always very difficult to, in a vacuum, especially when you're not in the draft room with these guys, you don't know exactly how their teams are crafted or what scheme they're going to run. And there's, a lot of variables. We try our best, obviously, as analysts, and we hope for a good 50-50, even if sometimes it doesn't feel that way. But Theo, thank you so much for giving us your time, or me, your time. When people listen to this, and if they don't already know your work, where can they find you?
Of course, you can find me at Theo Ash NFL on TikTok and Twitter, although I'm trying to get off of Twitter, honestly. But you can find me on there. And you can find me talking on podcasts on the Stay Hot podcast with my co-hosts Matt and Bladen. And that's pretty much it.
And I can vouch, as someone that follows all your stuff and listens to your stuff, like obviously, Theo is a fantastic voice in this space. So if you don't already, make sure you go follow and go support his work. But Theo, thank you so much again for your time. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, keep saying we, it's only me. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can do this again before the draft or just after. Thank you very much.
Anytime.